the Shurangama Sutra, with excerpts from the commentary by the Venerable Master Xuanhua, a new translation from the Buddhist Text Translation Society. Part 2, The Nature of Visual Awareness, Chapter 5, Visual Awareness is not dependent upon conditions. Clasping his hands, Ananda wept, mindful that the Buddha had compassionately rescued him and had bestowed upon him a profound teaching. He said respectfully to the Buddha, "Having heard the Buddha speak these marvelous words, I comprehend that my wondrously understanding mind is perfect at its source, and that it is the everlasting ground of my mind. I understand the Dharma that the Buddha has just spoken. I see that I have been revering the Buddha with my conditioned mind, but because I have only just now learned about my wondrously understanding mind, I do not dare as yet to accept it as my mind's fundamental ground. May the Buddha, in his all-pervading voice, compassionately give further instruction about this in order to uproot my doubts and bring me back to the supreme path." The Buddha said to Ananda, "You and others like you still listen to the Dharma with conditioned minds, and therefore you fail to understand its real nature. Consider this example. Suppose someone is pointing to the moon to show it to another person. That other person, guided by the pointing finger, should now look at the moon. But if he looks instead at the finger, taking it to be the moon, not only does he fail to see the moon, but he is mistaken too about the finger. He has confused the finger with which someone is pointing to the moon with the moon which is being pointed to. Moreover, his mistake about the finger shows he has failed to distinguish light from dark, in that he has confused what is dark, the finger, with what is light, the moon. He does not know the difference between the nature of light and the nature of darkness. In this way, he is like you. The moon represents the true mind. The Dharma, which is spoken, is the finger, since the Buddha speaks about the Dharma in order to point to the true mind. The person in the example doesn't recognize either the finger or the moon for what they are, and so they seem lost, although they are still there. He doesn't understand light and darkness. In other words, he doesn't know what is meant by enlightenment, or what is meant by the lack of enlightenment. He doesn't know what is meant by ignorance and what is meant by true understanding. The Buddha speaks about the Dharma in order to point to the true mind, and it was Ananda's mistake to suppose that the true mind was in the Dharma. The Buddha points that out to Ananda by means of the example of the finger and the moon. If you understand your mind to be what makes distinctions when you hear me speak about the Dharma, then that mind of yours would necessarily exist on its own, apart from my speaking, which it is making distinctions about. By analogy, a traveler who stops at an inn may stay for a night. He then goes on his way. He does not live there all the time, unlike the innkeeper, who, as the host, does not go anywhere. In the same way, if what makes distinctions when you hear me speak were truly your mind, then it would not go anywhere. But could the nature of the mind be such that it makes distinctions about sound independently of sound? And the mind that makes distinctions about my voice also makes distinctions about my appearance? What makes distinctions about visible objects cannot do so independently of the visible objects it distinguishes. Your mind that makes distinctions does not exist independently of the objects that it distinguishes. And when the making of distinctions ceases, such that neither space nor objects are distinguished, the state that Maskari Golisiputra and the others wrongly call the truth of the unmanifested nature, even then your mind does not have a distinction-making nature that exists independent of objects of mind. Thus, each of your mental states is dependent on something else. They are not like the host of an inn. Ananda said, "If each of my mental states is dependent on something else, then is the fundamental, wondrously understanding mind of which the thus come one speaks also dependent on something else?" I only hope that the Buddha will take pity on us and explain. The Buddha said to Ananda, "As you see me now, the fundamental luminous essence of visual awareness is not the wondrous essential understanding mind. Nevertheless, It can be compared to a second moon, rather to a reflection of the moon. Listen attentively. I will now show you what does not depend on anything. This great lecture hall, Ananda, opens to the east. Thus, when the sun rises, the hall is flooded with light. But the hall is in darkness in the middle of the night if the moon has not risen, or if the sky is obscured by clouds or fog. Further, one can see out through cracks in the doors and shutters, but the walls and roof block the view. Where the various objects are distinguished, we can perceive how they are related to one another. But where there are no objects, space is all that one sees. Where mists or clouds of dust are present, objects are obscured or distorted. Once the mist has dispersed, or once the dust has settled so that the air is pure again, one can see again everything clearly. Ananda, you have all observed how aspects of these phenomena will change. Now I will show you how the presence of each of them depends on a condition necessary to it. What are the conditions necessary to these changing phenomena, Ananda? The sun is a necessary condition for sunlight, since there can be no sunlight without the sun. Therefore, the sunlight is dependent upon the sun, which is a necessary condition for its presence. The moon's absence is a necessary condition for the darkness in the hall. Cracks in the doors and shutters are necessary conditions for your being able to see out. The walls and roof are necessary conditions for the view being blocked. Distinguishing the various objects is a necessary condition for observing how they are related to one another. The absence of objects is a necessary condition for seeing only space. Mists and clouds of dust are necessary conditions for obscuring or distorting our visual awareness of objects. Dispersal of the mist and the settling of the dust are necessary conditions for seeing clearly again. And every act of seeing the changing phenomena of this world belongs to one of these types. Consider these 8 types. What would you say is the necessary condition for the presence of the understanding nature that is the essence of your visual awareness? If the presence of light is a necessary condition for your visual awareness, then when light is absent, so that it is completely dark, you would not be able to see the darkness, which in fact you do see. Your mind makes distinctions about light and darkness and the other phenomena, but the essence of your visual awareness does not make these distinctions. Clearly, then, the mind that experiences these conditioned phenomena is not what is fundamentally you, but what is not these conditioned phenomena must be what is fundamentally you. If it is not you, what else could it be? Distinctions are being made when you perceive light and darkness, but not by your visual awareness. Rather, they are made by your distinction-making mind that responds to circumstances. Don't take that to be the essential nature of your awareness. Your knowledge of light and dark is an activity of your mind. Your visual awareness sees everything impartially, without making any distinction. The act of seeing is simply to see. The distinctions you make are made by your distinction-making mind. This particular section of text explains these teachings extremely well in a few words. All transitory characteristics are dependent on something else. They are not part of you. What stays with you and does not go anywhere else, what is not dependent on anyone or anything else, if that is not you, who is it? It is something you cannot give away. Know then that your mind is fundamentally wondrous, luminous, and pure. You have confused yourself and have lost track of what is fundamental. Constantly drifting and drowning, you have become submerged in the sea of death and rebirth. That is why the Thus Come One says you are to be pitied. Our true mind is not dependent on anything, but we ourselves are confused. It is something that belongs to us, but we don't realize that, so it seems to us that we have lost it. One who fails to understand the true mind will fall in life after life into the sea of suffering. Although we have not really lost our true minds, our falling is real enough. Suffering one death and rebirth after another is like being tossed about on the open ocean and drowning. If you have not ended death and rebirth, then even if you can handle the water and swim, you will drown after being tossed about long enough. The waters of the sea of death and rebirth are composed of the karmic offenses you create. You create karma because you do not recognize the true mind. It is said, the sea of karma is vast, it has no shore. Sometimes you are tossed about on its surface, and sometimes you sink to the bottom. Being in the water of that ocean is dangerous. That is what makes Ananda pitiable. He has put all his effort into intellectual learning. He is able to come up with many questions, but he still doesn't understand, even when the explanations are repeated.